Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I wanted to do another different type of episode. Forensics has always been an interesting topic, particularly when it comes to the aid of solving homicides or even just determining cause of death. But like anything, it took time to develop forensic science. With that, took people. One person in particular I'd like to highlight today as we discuss the evolution of the body farm. Bill Bass's name might not be particularly famous to many, but in the world of forensics, Dr. Bass revolutionized forensic anthropology by studying the way in which human corpses decompose. Moreover, he did so outside in Tennessee, where the bodies of those were brought there could rot naturally. In doing so, the term body farm was minted. So let's talk about how Dr. Bass and the creation of the body farm began. William Bass was born on August 30th, 1928, in Staunton, Virginia, to parents Marvin and Jenny Bass. He graduated in Staunton with a class of just 46. Bill attended Hampton-Sydney College for 3 years, then transferred to the University of Virginia for his undergraduate degree in psychology, graduating in 1951. He continued his studies at the U.S. Army Medical Research Laboratory from 1953 to 1954, where he studied psychophysiology. It was at this time Bill Tout's his forensic career began, after a traffic accident in the winter of 1953, in which 2 trucks struck each other, causing an inferno. The victims were numbered as 3 and charred beyond identification. Quickly, the drivers were identified and confirmed based on the vehicles they were driving and registration, but the third was a doe, an unknown person. According to Bill, by happenstance, the Saturday Evening Post wrote an article on Dr. Wilton M. Krogman, a physical anthropologist who, along with 2 other colleagues, created the science of forensic anthropology in the 1940s and 50s. While he was busy with cases from police and FBI, Dr. Krogman did identify a local anthropology professor, Dr. Charles E. Snow, who may be able to assist in identifying the last victim. Bill was, at the time, pursuing his master's degree in counseling at the University of Kentucky, where Dr. Snow worked. Bill was even a student of Dr. Snow's, taking an anthropology class under him. Dr. Snow asked if Bill would be interested in going with him to look over the remains. In his book, Death's Acre, Dr. Bill jokes that he may have been only included in this examination as he had a car to take them to the location. It wasn't until April of 1955 that the remains were exhumed. As the casket was brought up, it poured with water from the rising water table the spring rains had brought them. The body was burned, rotted, and waterlogged, according to Bill. The lawyer who had called upon the identification had done much of the legwork prior to the anthropologist's arrival. A woman went missing at the time of the accident, and so medical and dental records were already obtained and given to Dr. Snow and Bill. After confirming this was indeed the body of a female, her dental records were used to confirm her identity. For their work, Dr. Snow received payment of $25 as his consulting fee. He paid Bill $5 for taking him to the cemetery. From that moment on, Bill no longer wanted to be a psychologist. Instead, anthropology had him hooked. He received his master's from the University of Kentucky in 1956. After he spent the summer at the Smithsonian Institution analyzing Native American skeletons, he was accepted into Harvard, into their anthropology PhD program, but turned it down to study at the University of Pennsylvania in their PhD program under Wilton Krogman himself. Bill states that shortly after the semester started, Dr. Krogman fell down a set of stairs and shattered his left leg, ending up in a hip-length cast. Bill offered to drive him to and from the university while he mended, as the city bus, his normal transportation, was too difficult to manage with that cast on. Dr. Krogman accepted, and the relationship budded into mentor-mentee. The doctor would even assign Bill things to read so they could discuss them during their commute. From there, Dr. Krogman began bringing Bill to forensic identification cases. Both men would examine the bones, and then they would compare findings. The doctor would demand support and document each of Bill's statements with scientific articles. Bill says of this that Dr. Krogman's methods were effective in retaining information and helping his future in the courtrooms. Starting in the summer of 1957, Bill went out to South Dakota and began working alongside the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers, archaeologists, and anthropologists to excavate the area behind the newly dammed Missouri River, something he would continue to do for 14 summers. Bill completed his Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1960. From there, Bill took a teaching job at the University of Nebraska in January of 1960. After 9 months, he spent 11 years at the University of Kansas in Lawrence teaching. He was then hired by the University of Tennessee in 1971 to head their new anthropology department, which was in the process of being split from history at the time. So now that we've talked about Bill's education, let's move on to what shaped him into the man who started this body farm. The story he writes about in his book starts with an unidentified woman at the Kentucky Bureau of Investigations, or KBI, brings to him at the university in 1962. The pieces that he had were rotting, but Bill used them to teach some of his brand new anthropology students about identification, stating that when he received remains, he would put them in anatomical order. In this case, he had a skull and a few other bones, including a femur. This woman, through identification of teeth, femur length for height, and some indicators on the skull, was theorized to be Mary Louise Downing, a 32-year-old black female who went missing August 10th of 1962, 3 weeks before the remains were brought to Bill. He says of this time, anthropologists were not often taken to the crime scene, so police were the ones to gather remains and bring them to him. He also states that during this time he took the remains to his home and boiled them down to a skeletal state. This first time he accidentally let the pot boil over, and as a result, his wife got a brand new stove. Still, Mary Louise' murder remained unsolved, but her skull stayed with Bill and was used to teach students and train homicide investigators, crime lab technicians, etc. In 1964, Harold Nye, the associate director of the KBI, asked Bill a question. Could he look at a skeleton and estimate the time of death? In this case, that of a cow. Cattle rustlers in the area were killing and field dressing cows rather than taking off with them. At the time, Bill collaborated with a paleontologist and informed Harold that they couldn't determine when a cow was killed, but the age of the cow itself, unless a farmer was willing to kill a cow and they could watch the rate of decomposition, likely needing to do it multiple times based on the time of year to determine the rate of decomposition based on elemental factors, including heat. At the time, this notion did not take off. In December of 1970, a detective from Olathe brought Bill an evidence box. Inside were a set of small and incomplete remains, found by a quail hunter a week prior. An exam revealed weathered remains. They had been out in the elements for months. Fine blonde hair strands were found suggesting a Caucasian child, around age 3 based on what dentition was left in the jaw. What wasn't there made the identification next to impossible. The detective on the case believed the child to be Lisa Elaine Silvers, who was 2.5 when she went missing. Her uncle Gerald Silvers had babysat her on April 22, 1970, reporting he fell asleep and when he woke up, she was gone. But after investigating, police found that Gerald was wanted in California for second-degree robbery as well as a hit and run. While jailed, 2 inmates serving time with Gerald turned state's evidence. They said he bragged about raping and killing Lisa. For this, he was indicted and brought back to stand trial. But there was still a problem. The remains Bill looked over were never positively identified. The detective reached back out to Bill, pleading for him for a way to identify her. After seeing a photograph, Bill told the detective they needed to find her missing teeth, which, may I remind you, were found in a stream out on a prairie. The two went out to the location, and Bill was shown where the remains were found. He looked downstream and found 14 teeth, more bones of the hand, feet, and even some vertebrae. Bill went over the teeth, looking for anything before fitting them into the skull. That's when it came together. Literally. There was a gap in her 2 front teeth and a notch at one corner of each of her 4 upper incisors. When comparing to a photo of Lisa, he knew. They had found her. Unfortunately, Gerald was acquitted after lack of evidence of how Lisa died was noted. Then, in June 1st, 1971, Bill went to Knoxville to University of Tennessee to head their anthropological program. On December 29, 1977, Williamson County Sheriff Office called on Bill. They had a complaint that a family cemetery had been disturbed. During the investigation, rather than finding a grave robber, they found a new body, though this one was missing his head, a hand, and the feet. The body was in advanced decay and had been buried sitting, requiring less digging to place him on the ground. The body was brought back to the university and the bones were cleaned, but nothing on the body would determine cause of death. That was until the skull was found, inside the coffin of the grave it sat atop, found along with previously missing hand and feet. The skull had an entry and exit wound from a large caliber gun that shattered the back of the skull. But it seems this led for Dr. Bill's embarrassment. The gun was a .58 caliber mini ball, a gun used in the Civil War. The body was that of William Shy. A grave robber had attempted to remove him from his resting place but struggled and eventually gave up. This means that Dr. Bill, who had estimated originally time of death to have been recently, was off by 113 years. He had not anticipated the colonel to be embalmed, which had preserved him. He says of this, while he was personally embarrassed, he was also intrigued scientifically. After once receiving a body that had been found in water, Dr. Bill wrapped it in plastic and left it in a mop closet for the weekend. At the time, there were no coolers available to him. The janitor, however, found this and gave everyone a hard time, letting him know it would not happen again. Dr. Bill went to the dean, and future bodies were sent to the College of Agriculture's vacant building off of a farm. The building was next to a correctional facility. This is where the bodies were housed until they could be cleaned for years. However, Dr. Bill noticed few prints and bodies being moved, if ever so slightly. It turned out the inmates were made aware of what was housed in the barn and had a habit of going sightseeing after delivery of a new corpse. After 6 years as the head of anthropology department, it was time to expand. The colonel had been a lesson he had not forgotten. The need to study a human body, well, hundreds of them, to help with the research became a necessity. Luckily, there was an acre of land across the Tennessee River from the main campus. For years, the medical center used it to burn their hospital trash. Now was Dr. Bill's. In the fall of 1980, he and his students rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They removed trees and brush out of the center, laid down gravel to make driveways for trucks to transport bodies and equipment. Water lines and electricity were run to the site. They erected an outbuilding to store tools. Then an area was fenced off and named the Forensic Anthropology Facility. When the site was ready, the request for bodies went out to 95 different counties. In May of 1981, the body of a 73-year-old man was donated by his daughter. He was laid on the concrete pad, then covered with a wooden and wire mesh screen. With him, the body farm was officially on its way to increasing their knowledge. Around the same time, Bill Rodriguez, a teacher's assistant, was brought out by Dr. Bill to a crime scene. While there, Bill, who originally was going to study animals, found his love for anthropology himself, and specifically, bugs. Through the use of decomposing cadavers, Bill Rodriguez was able to study insect activity. Bill presented his findings 9 months after beginning at an annual meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences in Orlando, Florida. He was a hit. Furthermore, he published his results in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. The weather at the body farm in May went from 58 to 80s within a matter of days. Rapidly, the bodies decomposed. It was here that they labeled the stages into 4 broad categories: the fresh stage, the bloated stage, the decay stage, and the dry stage. While it took approximately a month to move to the skeletal stage, for the study, the body was left for another 4 months before taking them in and cleaning, then measuring various bones for statistical purposes. The first several years produced many bodies for research, but when the adjacent hospital meant to expand their parking lot, it encroached on the body farm. A local construction worker went to eat his lunch one day and found himself face to face with numerous decomposing bodies. He brought his complaint to his mother, who was one of the heads of a group called Solutions to Issues of Concern to Knoxvillians, or SICK for short. SICK came out and protested the bodies. Well, they did acknowledge it was for science and could help solve murders. They didn't want it happening in their town. The solution was a larger chain-link fence that surrounded the entire acre of the property. As time continued to move forward, bodies were monitored for decay in all different areas. Some were partially submerged, completely submerged, left out in the sun, put in the shade, and during all different seasons and temperatures. Flocks of students came to learn from Dr. Bill. Science continued to advance at the challenge of Dr. Bill, who seemed to enjoy teaching and growing alongside his students, 2 of which were Arpad Vass and Emily Craig. Arpad first ventured that based on the bacteria in the soil under a body, time of death could be determined. After months of research, he found it was what the bacteria left, not the bacteria itself, that was of use. But it was limited to those bodies who were actively decaying. Bodies that had been skeletonized, the bacteria had used all their resources and left. Slowly, the soil under the skeleton would change again. Whereas Emily Craig was a student that came from a different background. Unlike most anthropology students, her background was in medical illustration, working at an orthopedic clinic for years before taking Dr. Bill's course. At this time, Dr. Bill challenged his students with a trick question, looking at a skeleton and determining whether it was a Caucasoid or Negroid person. In all his years, Emily was the only one to get the answer correct. Based on the skull, all other students would write Caucasoid. However, x-rays of the man on identification confirmed he was an elderly black man. When Dr. Bill challenged how Emily knew and got the question right, that everyone got it wrong based on the skull, she informed him she didn't look at the skull. She looked instead at the knee, based on her orthopedic knowledge. From there, Dr. Bill encouraged her to write a dissertation. She did, and even went further, more than the knee. The angle of the interior seam in the femur, called the Blum-Satz lines, are different based on race. Emily even created a formula to distinguish between the two, and it's approximately 90% accurate. By 1993, Dr. Bill had been at the University of Tennessee for over 2 decades. He also created a new forensic anthropology section within the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, or AFES. In addition to that, he served as the Tennessee forensic anthropologist. That summer led to the nickname that patch of land that Dr. Bill teaches and studies to finally be named. A writer gave him a call. She wanted to do an experiment in order to have her crime novel be as authentic as possible. Within the experiment, several items were placed under a body, and then the body was left for 6 days before being removed and examined. The results were sent to the novelist, and she wrote her book. When she next talked to Dr. Bill in February of 1994, she told him she was done writing and that the book was called The Body Farm. Following the release of the book, the nickname The Body Farm began to be used by police and FBI, and eventually Dr. Bill himself. For years since then, Dr. Bill has continued to work the body farm and famous cases in the South, including the Zoo Man. As he's aged and found himself in need of a pacemaker, Dr. Bill knows one thing. Upon his death, he'd like to continue working at the body farm. According to the Forensic Anthropology Center, or FAC, which Dr. Bill established in 1987, quote, the skeletal collections provide unparalleled opportunities to study modern human skeletal variations, pathology, and trauma. The hallmark of these collections is the UTK-donated skeletal collection that now consists of over 1,800 individuals, the largest collection of contemporary human skeletons in the United States. The Forensic Data Bank, FDB, contains data on over 4,080 forensic cases in the U.S. and has recently expanded to include contemporary individuals from Central and South America, Europe, and Asia. The FDB has been instrumental in documenting changes within human populations. End quote. Dr. Bass retired in 1999 after heading UT's Department of Anthropology for nearly 3 decades. UT dedicated the Forensic Anthropology Building in 2011 to Dr. William M. Bass. I know this was a different case, but I hope you enjoyed listening to this. And to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.